Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give folks just a minute or so to join and then we'll get started. If you're just joining us, we're just giving folks a minute or so here to jump on and then we'll get rolling with the webinar. I know folks are still joining, but I'm going to go ahead and kick us off and start with some of our housekeeping items as folks continue to join. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on expanding public access, SB 707 updates to the Brown Act. I'm Melissa Keene. I'm the Director of Enterprise Programs and Special Projects here at ILG, and I will be your host and moderator for today's session. Here's an overview of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to share a little bit of information about ILG and some data that we've collected from local governments across the state related to this to kind of set the stage for today's conversation. And then I will turn it over to our presenters today, Alex and Nick, who will share updates to the Brown Act and how 707 is being implemented in local agencies across the state. And then we will have time for audience Q&A, and then we will wrap up and adjourn by 1:30. So a couple of quick housekeeping items. As you're joining, you probably noticed that you're muted. You will be on mute for the duration of today's webinar, but that doesn't mean you can't ask us questions. So in your control bar on Zoom, you should see a Q&A box. Please feel free to type any questions into that Q&A box during at any point during today's session. We'll be monitoring that on the back end and pulling questions into a queue for our Q&A at the end of today's webinar. You also probably heard that we are recording today's session, and that recording, as well as all the materials we will talk about, will be available to you all shortly after today's webinar. You can also turn on captions if you'd like to. That's also in your control panel. You should see that the toolbar on the bottom here, Zoom screen, and you can select show captions, and then you will be able to see those throughout today's webinar. So quickly going through just some background information about ILG and what we're hearing from a number of you across the state. So we are a statewide nonprofit and nonpartisan organization committed to supporting local governments. So we are an affiliate of the League of California Cities, and they founded us over 70 years ago, but we serve all 2,500 plus local agencies across the state, including cities, counties, and special districts. And we are really committed to delivering practical training, easy to use resources so that you all can effectively implement policies on the ground. So we do that in a number of ways. We provide a lot of education and training, like today's webinar, but we also do longer trainings, a lot of conference sessions, in-person sessions, etc. We also provide technical assistance, capacity building, and research for local agencies across the state in a number of program areas. Today's session is related to our leadership and governance pillar, which helps set the foundation for transparency and trust and accountability for agencies. We do a lot of conversations around governance best practices, relationships between elected officials and staff, and all of those foundational pieces, as well as the mandated trainings around ethics and harassment prevention. In addition to that pillar of work, we also have pillars on workforce development and civics education, public engagement, and sustainability. And so we have a whole host of resources and archived webinars and a number of other things on our website available to you all. So please check that out if you aren't familiar or you haven't engaged with us in some of these other topic areas. Before we jump into the presentation, I want to ground this again in what we're hearing from you all across the state. Earlier this year, we conducted a survey of local leaders, and we heard from hundreds of agencies across California, representing cities and counties and special districts, and even some folks from the state, including executive leadership, staff from across all departments, elected and appointed officials, and even small jurisdictions to large agencies with over 1,000 employees. And we asked them a series of questions, and I'm going to highlight a couple of things about that are related to today's conversation. In relation to governance pressures and leadership challenges that folks are seeing across the state, things that are rising to the top include this ethics and transparency and accountability piece that's obviously tied directly to the rules around open meetings and the Brown Act. Managing conflict, incivility, and misconduct also related to those public meetings. And we'll talk about that as it relates to those disruption policies and things of that nature that are included in the new regulations around SB 707. And also related to this, we asked questions around public engagement and some of the challenges you all are facing as you're trying to do this engagement, both in open meetings and public meetings with your boards and councils, but also as it relates to additional public workshops and things you might be trying to gather feedback on. And incivility and hostility in public meetings also rising to the top here as it relates to outreach and engagement that you're trying to conduct with your communities. And so this is all to say, we recognize that these are challenges for you all across the state, and we are trying to develop resources and webinars and trainings and things of that nature to help you address these things on the ground. And so today's conversation is part of that effort in terms of making sure that you all are aware of the changes that have been happening at the state level that you need to be thinking about as you're conducting public meetings and council and board meetings on the ground. But also know that we recognize that these are ongoing challenges for you all, and we'll be using that to inform additional resources that we develop or update throughout the year, as well as additional webinar sessions and things of that nature. So please, again, connect with us offline if you have questions or want access to any of these resources, and stay tuned for additional webinars and content to help you address some of these challenges. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists for today. I'm joined by Alex Giragosian from Colantuno, Highsmith and Watley, and Nick Norvell from Best and Krieger, who will go through an overview of the changes that SB 707 has been implementing for you all across the state. So with that, I will turn it over to my partners on the line.
Thank you so much, Melissa. We can go ahead to the next slide and get started with our intro. So SB 707 is about a year old now. It first took effect in January 1st. A part of it took effect January 1st, 2026. And another part of it took effect July 1st, 2026. And here's what it's basically trying to do. I'm quoting, it says, "This act is necessary to modernize the Ralph M. Brown Act to reflect recent technological changes that can promote greater public access to local officials." Right? So SB 707 is really about integrating technology into the Brown Act. We're going to break it up, this conversation, into three parts. The first part is a clarification and expansion of teleconferencing rules. The second are miscellaneous changes. And the third are public access updates for eligible legislative bodies. I want to pause here and just explain how we're breaking this up because I think it's important and frankly, it addresses a lot of the questions we received ahead of time. A lot of the questions ahead of time were basically, does SB 707 apply to us? And the answer is probably yes, but it depends on which part. So this first bullet point here, clarification and expansion of teleconferencing rules. When we talk about these teleconferencing rules, that's your electeds and the teleconferencing options available to them, right? So the first bullet point is going to apply to all public agencies. It's part of SB 707. The second one, miscellaneous changes, is also going to apply to all public agencies. But that third bullet point, public access updates for eligible legislative bodies, that one only applies to this term eligible legislative bodies. And it's really about providing access and teleconferencing options and stuff like that for members of the public. So the first bullet point, think about it as involving your elected officials or your appointed officials. And the third bullet point is really about members of the public. So the focuses are different. And the first two apply to all agencies. The last one only applies to the ones that meet that definition of eligible legislative body. Next slide. So what are our options? Let's talk about a brief history quickly. Since 1988, we've had the traditional teleconferencing option. And what I mean by that is probably the one you're all used to, which is you can meet remotely, but you're going to have to post your agenda in that physical location and you're going to have to make it open to the public. That's the one where we were commonly using pre-COVID. And then COVID hit, and we realized that, you know what, no one really wants to have a remote meeting when you're opening up your private space to members of the public. So at that time, if you remember, we were on lockdown and we couldn't really have members of the public coming into our home and conducting these meetings with us because, we were all trying to distance from each other. And so the state came up with this. So at that time, the governor suspended the Brown Act, and then the state legislator came up with a fix, and it's the state of emergency exception that basically allowed all legislative bodies to meet fully remote so long as they can make certain findings every month. Um, that was in 2021. And then 2023, the legislator said, you know what, this remote access seems to be working for a lot of people. And we want to continue providing options where members of the legislative body can continue to meet remotely and not allow people to enter their personal space. So the legislator created the just cause exception, the emergency circumstances exception, neighborhood councils, and in 2024, we had the Student Body Association. Now, as part of this presentation, we'll talk about the first four, traditional, state of emergency, just cause, and emergency circumstances, but we're not going to talk about the last two, neighborhood council and student body associations. One thing to keep in mind, these exceptions that exist, there are a menu of options, right? So they're optional. Certainly, you don't have to take advantage of them if your legislative body adopts a policy that says we're not going to take advantage of just cause and emergency circumstances. You can do that. Next slide. All right, so we kind of touched on it already, but the traditional teleconferencing method, the one that was adopted back in 1988, has the following requirements. First, you need to identify each teleconference location, and you need to post the agenda at the teleconference location. So to give you an example, I had a council member recently went on a trip to Hawaii, wanted to participate in a meeting. So what did they do? They went to the lobby of their hotel, posted on the door of the hotel that a copy of our agenda, and they took the meeting from the hotel and from the hotel lobby, and that met the requirements of. And then on our agenda, we also noticed that um, the meeting is taking place both at City Hall as well as the whatever the hotel's name was in Hawaii. There is no limit on the number of traditional teleconferencing, um, the number of times you can take advantage of traditional teleconferencing, but you will need a quorum physically present in order for a member to participate using this traditional teleconferencing method. So if you're a body of five, you're going to need at least three present physically. If you're a fourth and fifth are going to take advantage of traditional teleconferencing. In terms of means, you can use a call-in method like a phone call, or it can be internet-based like Zoom. The public needs to have access to the teleconference location, which is why you would do it in a lobby instead of a hotel room. Uh, Disclosures, there's no disclosure that needs to be made at the meeting, which is a little bit different than some of the other disclosures we'll get into later. And just keep this in mind when you're doing teleconference meetings with your electeds, always use roll call votes. So it's not going to be a voice vote. It's not going to be all in favor, say aye. It's going to be Councilmember X, how do you vote? Councilmember B, how do you vote? Councilmember C, how do you vote? All that. Next slide. Reasonable accommodations. This one's brand new. So you don't have to comply with the traditional teleconferencing method if you are seeking a reasonable accommodation due to some disability. Like the traditional teleconferencing method, there's no limit on the number of times you can use this. You don't need to have a quorum physically present either in order to use this because If you're using this method, you count toward quorum, which is very unique. You don't get this in a lot of the other exceptions. So if you're taking advantage of this, if you are somehow disabled and you seek a reasonable accommodation, you count toward quorum. If you're going to use this method, there's a two-way audiovisual platform you need to use. And then the only exception there is if for some reason your disability prevents you from showing your face, at that time you can probably use just audio instead of both audio and video. This exception is not available to members of the public in the same way that the traditional method is, right? Because under the traditional method, you take advantage of it, and a member of the public can come and sit next to you in that space and take advantage of that method of teleconferencing as well. This is not available to the public. This is unique to the individual with the disability. However, that's why there's these three asterisks there. However, the Brown Act does contemplate the legislative body providing some kind of reasonable accommodation for those individuals of the public who request some kind of reasonable accommodation ahead of time, right? So usually you've seen this on your agenda. There's a line on the agenda that says, pursuant to the ADA, if you have a disability, please contact city clerk at X by this time. And if someone contacts you, then for that individual, you can provide a reasonable accommodations. But just keep in mind that this reasonable accommodation exception is always unique to the individual. If you have someone that's 18 years or over in the room with you, you need to disclose that that person is present and their relationship to you. And again, roll call votes. Next slide. Okay, so here are the new exceptions that SB 707 provides to us for elected officials using teleconferencing. Um, Health authorities, I'm not going to get into it. It's a very specific definition. State of emergency, we'll get into it. Just cause, we'll talk about. Neighborhood council, we won't talk about. Community college student organization, we won't talk about. Eligible subsidiary body, we will. And multi-jurisdictional body, we will. And again, just to reiterate, these are a menu of options, right? So they're optional. You can choose. If your legislative body doesn't want to take advantage of these, you can adopt a policy that says we're not taking advantage of these. Next slide. So the requirements to use teleconferencing, you need to provide two-way audio-visual platform, right? So that's like a Zoom, or two-way telephonic service and a live webcasting of the meeting. So that's like using the phone and also uh, showing your meeting on YouTube, for example, but webcasting on YouTube. What you cannot do is just call in, right? There has to be a way for you to both see the meeting and you have to be able to have some kind of, it has to be both audio and there has to be a visual component as well. Uh, you have to pause the meeting until a disruption to teleconferencing for the public is resolved. So if there's a breakup of the feed for the individual elected official, you don't have to stop the meeting, right? Because that's if I'm the elected official and I'm using Zoom and my Zoom isn't working, that's my problem. We don't have to stop the meeting. But if I'm an elected official and I'm using Zoom and the Zoom link breaks for whatever reason because the public agency posted the wrong link or somehow they're not able to display on their end, then we have to stop the meeting because members of the public now won't be able to participate. The remote participation of members of the legislative body must be noted in the minutes. And elected officials who are participating remotely, again, if there's someone in the room that's 18 and over, they need to disclose that and they need to state what the relationship of that person is to them. One point I just want to flag here is this public access requirement and the way it's defined. Um, Teleconferencing for elected officials, this requirement, two-way audiovisual platform or two-way telephonic service and live webcasting, is different than what you're going to see for eligible legislative bodies when we have to provide teleconferencing options to members of the public. It's a little bit confusing. Nick's going to get into it. I'm just flagging it now that the teleconferencing options you provide to your elected officials under SB 707 may be different than, at least they are different than under state law, what's required to be provided to members of the public. And Nick will get into that later on in his slides. Next slide. Okay, so you all probably remember the state of emergency. We were all participating via Zoom remotely. This is the only one where the entire board, the entire council can participate remotely. There is no other exception that allows full remote participation. Under the existing rule, when you determine by a majority vote that a meeting in person presents risk to health or safety due to an emergency, due to a state of emergency, right, something declared by the governor, and you renew that vote every 45 days, you can continue to meet fully remote. Here's the fix, and I think it's a good fix here. And let me highlight a problem. What happens when, and I'll give you a real example of an agency I work with. Let's say there's a fire and the whole town needs to be evacuated, and the governor hasn't declared a state of emergency yet. Technically, uh, under this exception, we could not use this fully remote state of emergency exception, right? Because the governor hasn't declared a state of emergency. So we couldn't have meetings of the legislative body. Under this new exception, the legislative body can meet remotely if it declares a local emergency, right? So a good fix by the legislator. Um, we don't have to wait for the governor to declare the state of emergency. We can declare a local emergency and meet fully remote if we need to. And of course, it needs to meet the definition of a local emergency, and that's defined by statute. Again, no limit on the number of times you can use this. Quorum, everyone counts toward quorum if they're participating remotely. All votes by roll call. And one change here, you can't just call in anymore. It's got to be a two-way telephonic or two-way audiovisual platform, right? So most likely a Zoom. Next slide. Just cause. So pre SB 707, you were used to seeing two terms. You saw something called emergency circumstances, which was a physical or family medical emergency. And you saw something called just cause, which was child or caregiving need, contagious illness, travel while on official business of the legislative body. We have a new definition of just cause under SB 707, which merges emergency circumstances and just cause and adds a few other things. So under this new definition, under SB 707, just cause is defined as a physical or family medical emergency, childcare or caregiving need, contagious illness, travel while on official business of the legislative body. If you're with an immunocompromised family member, so like let's say someone's getting chemo treatment, and you want to just be careful about bringing uh, germs or bacteria or viruses home, you could probably take that meeting remotely and use this exception. Military service obligations that require members to be at least 50 miles outside the boundaries of the agency. And this last one, a physical or mental condition that is not subject to accommodation. So think something that doesn't count as an ADA disability, but is still a physical or mental condition that might require you to, or that might prevent you from participating in person. What comes to mind often for this one, and what I've seen used, is pregnancy, because pregnancy is not an ADA disability, but pregnancy may prevent an individual from participating remotely. And so you can take advantage of this just cause exception if you're pregnant, for example. Next slide. So for the just cause exception, the requirement you need to disclose the reason to the legislative body at your earliest opportunity, and that reason will probably be noted in the minutes. Um, the limit is 2 meetings per year if your body meets once per month, 5 meetings per year if your body meets twice per month, and 7 meetings per year if your body meets 7 times a month, or three or more times a month. This is unique to the body. So let's say you are um, a special district board member and you also serve on two committees. And your special district meets, uh, let's say, once a month, and your other two committees also meet once a month. So that means you can use the just cause exception twice during the year for your board meetings, and then twice again for each of your committee meetings, right? Because this exception is unique to the body. It's not unique to the individual. I mean, it is unique to both, I should say, the individual and the body. Quorum. Remote participant does not count toward quorum, so you're going to need a quorum physically present, and the means two-way audiovisual platform, right? Next slide. A subsidiary body. This is brand new. An eligible subsidiary body is defined as a commission, committee, board, or other body of a local agency, whether permanent or temporary, created by charter, ordinance, resolution, or formal action of legislative body, right? So just think of all your subsidiary bodies that exist, all your committees and boards underneath your legislative body that are exclusively advisory, right? They don't take any final action. They're not authorized to take final action on legislation, regulation, contracts, license, permits, or other entitlements, grants, or allocations of funds, and does not have primary subject matter jurisdiction regarding elections, budgets, police oversight, privacy, public library materials, or taxes. So it's a little bit confusing, but like let's give some examples. If you are an advisory body created by the city council to evaluate some kind of special tax, you could not use this eligible, you are not an eligible subsidiary body, right? Because your primary subject matter jurisdiction is tax related. But if you're an advisory body created by the city council to advise them on some kind of traffic plan, you are within the definition of this new term, eligible subsidiary body. And then let's say you are, what are the consequences? So next slide. So if you are, you can take advantage of remote meetings under this exception, assuming that the legislative body has authorized the use of teleconferencing and renews the vote every 6 months, may withdraw authorization at will. At least one staff member shall be present at the physical location designated in the meeting. An elected official serving as a member of the subsidiary body cannot take advantage of this provision, right? And procedures for acting on recommendation of the legislative body exist. And the procedures are they're spelled out basically in the legislation. I'll give you a real life example of where I've seen this happen. Our firm represents a local agency formation commission, and this local agency formation commission has a committee composed of city managers. And these city managers, as you can imagine, are very busy people. So trying to get them all in the room at the same time is very challenging. So they're taking advantage of this eligible subsidiary body exception to have fully remote meetings. To basically allow all the city managers to participate remotely so they don't have to come in to one meeting location. And we did that by having the LAFCO commission approve the use of this exception for 6 months. Again, the means are the same. Uh, Remote participant does count toward quorum, right? And there's no limit on its use except for all the requirements listed above. Next slide. Multi-jurisdictional body. Again, a new term, did not exist before. A multi-jurisdictional board, commission, or advisory body of a multi-jurisdictional cross-county agency, the membership of which board, commission, or advisory body is appointed. And let me pause there real quick. Well, we have the definition. We also have a definition of multi-jurisdictional. Let me go on and say that. It's a legislative body that includes representatives from more than one county, city, or special district. A legislative body of a joint powers entity. So a common question we got is, what does cross-county agency mean? And we got this question often, and I wasn't really able to explain what it was. And so fortunately, the California League of Cities circulates this omnibus bill. It's the local government omnibus bill, and you make the intention of this omnibus bill is to make these like little edits to the to the statutes to basically clarify the intention of things. And this year, SB 1439 is including a clarification to cross counties. So the current bill, SB 1439, the omnibus bill, is crossing out this term cross county agency and is replacing it with intra county or inter county agency to clarify that if you are a bunch of government agencies working together within the same county or a bunch of government agencies working together not within the same county or cross counties from representing different counties, you can both take advantage of eligible jurisdictional bodies. So hopefully that bill passes. It's currently passed in the Senate and it's in an assembly committee. So we'll see if that passes, but likely will, given that it's an omnibus bill and omnibus bills aren't really controversial. Next slide. In order to take advantage of this exception, the legislative body must authorize itself to use teleconferencing via resolution. If members receive compensation, then they must remotely attend from a location open to the public. The agenda and minutes need to reflect which members participate remotely. Remote location must be at least 20 miles away from the physical meeting location. Again, same uh, requirements in terms of the means. For quorum, the remote participant does not count toward quorum, so you're going to need a quorum physically present. And there is a total limit on the number of times you can use this exception. Next slide. So this is my last slide before I turn it over to Nick. Just a side-by-side comparison. So the traditional teleconferencing method existed before and continues to exist under SB 707. SB 707 has given us a new, I'm referring to it here as ADA, but this reasonable accommodation exception. SB 707 also gives us this new health authority exception, which is very specific, and I didn't talk about it much in this presentation. SB 707 expands state of emergency to include local emergencies. SB 707 expands the definition of just cause, and it basically expanded so much that it included emergency circumstances. So emergency circumstances doesn't exist anymore as a standalone exception. It's been swallowed up by just cause. And we also have neighborhood councils, community college student organizations, which existed before and just been clarified. And then we have these two new ones, eligible subsidiary body and multi-jurisdictional body. So here is your full menu under SB 707 of the allowable teleconferencing options for elected and appointed officials. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nick.
Thanks, Alex. So I'm going to be turning to the next slide. And before we get into sort of the meat of my portion of the presentation and one of the main topics of interest for eligible legislative bodies, I'm going to continue talking about the items that went into effect as of January 1st, 2026. All of the changes that Alex went over related to teleconferencing went into effect as of January 1st, and so do these additional miscellaneous items. One of the things that SB 707 did was it combined a number of other Brown Act related bills that were percolating in the legislature at that same time and put them essentially all into SB 707. So there are some miscellaneous changes that relate to things that are not teleconferencing or not for eligible legislative bodies, but deal with some other topics. So I'm going to talk about those briefly just under this miscellaneous updates, and then I'll turn to the changes that went into effect as of July 1st, 2026. So the first topic is social media restrictions. Some of you may recall that the legislature in 2021 adopted specific rules relating to how members of legislative bodies could communicate with each other via social media. And some of those rules are very specific. For example, prohibiting members of legislative bodies from even interacting one-on-one via social media on matters that are within their legislative body's jurisdiction. That could include liking, commenting, otherwise reacting via social media. So there are items to be careful of there. The notable thing is that when those restrictions went into place in 2021, the law was temporary at the time. There was a sunset date. Now those restrictions are a permanent part of the Brown Act. So that's one item that was notable from SB 707, that those restrictions are continuing on. The next item down also relates to something that was in some ways in the Brown Act prior to SB 707, but now it's been strengthened. Previously, the Brown Act encouraged or said agencies could provide copies of the Brown Act to persons elected or appointed. Now it is a mandatory requirement to provide copies of the Brown Act to persons who are elected or appointed. Uh, our view is that electronic copies of the Brown Act are probably sufficient to satisfy this requirement, but if a member of a legislative body requests a printed version, we would encourage providing that to them in compliance with this section. Next slide, please. Another item is compensation or benefits of executives of agencies. So previously, the law was that before final action, you would have to provide a verbal summary of salary or benefit changes for certain local agency executives. Technically, the definition that was referred to in the Brown Act already included department heads within that definition, but now SB 707 now specifically includes the term department heads and similar administrative provisions. So I would see this more as a clarification than necessarily a legal addition, but it's a solid reminder that when you are taking final action on salary benefit changes of anyone who's considered an executive, including department heads, there must be a verbal summary before that's done. And generally that means the item should not be on consent. It should be on regular agenda and you have that at least brief verbal summary before that takes place. The next item down is not having special meetings on the legislative body's salary or benefits. Some of you may be familiar with the prohibition in the Brown Act on not having special meetings on executives' pay or benefits. That rule now extends to the legislative body itself. So if the legislative body is considering an increase in its own salary, if it has a salary, some do, some don't, or the per diem compensation that board members or council members may receive, that has to take place now at a regular meeting with the 72-hour agenda posting requirement. Next slide, please. An additional change is clarifying that disruptive virtual attendees can be removed from the meeting. This is something that agencies probably can just deal with using your teleconferencing or webcasting platform like Zoom and muting someone. Generally, we would strongly recommend just muting them if you have the ability to do that rather than kicking them out of the meeting entirely. But you can follow the process of providing a warning to the person, warning that they may be removed from the meeting if they continue their disruptive activities, etc., and removing virtual attendees. Again, for most platforms, you have lesser consequences that you can apply to the person who is being truly disruptive. But technically, there is the ability to remove them from the meeting entirely if you cannot get a hold of the disruption through lesser means. The next item down is something called the committee exception. This is something that has long existed in the Brown Act, but I don't think many agencies took advantage of it, so it's not widely known about. But essentially, the Brown Act does not require public comments on agenda items if a committee of the body already considered the item, unless there were substantial changes between the committee and the main legislative body considering it. This is known as the committee exception. And so essentially, it doesn't require you to have public comments on that. Again, I don't think many agencies applied this rule or relied heavily on it. One of the things that SB 707 did was it narrowed this committee exception or provided additional limitations on it. So this exception cannot be used if a quorum of the committee did not participate from a single physical location for the committee meeting, or if the committee has primary subject matter jurisdiction over some of the things that Alex talked about as part of his presentation, elections, budgets, police oversight, privacy, library materials, or tax and spending proposals. So again, this is not a widely used item by many agencies in my experience, but if your agency does use this committee exception, it is notable now that there are certain limitations on it. And then there were other minor updates or clarifications throughout the Brown Act under SB 707 that I won't get into. But we can move on to one of the bigger topics from SB 707 and its updates on the next slide. So I'm going to be talking about the requirements for only certain types of legislative bodies, what the Brown Act now calls eligible legislative bodies. The rules that apply to eligible legislative bodies went into effect as of July 1st, 2026, and there are various requirements, some more cumbersome than others, but these are a lot of notable changes, and this is where a lot of the consternation and worry and burdensomeness about SB 707 went into effect. So one of the really important things to note for those of you who are participating is whether your agency is actually subject to these requirements or not, or has a legislative body that is subject to these requirements. I will just say up front, most special districts are not subject to these requirements. It generally is going to apply to most cities, most counties, and then only very large or complex special districts. So let's talk about the specific definition of eligible legislative body. It's the most senior body, for example, the city council or the board of supervisors of the following types of agencies: a city over 30,000, a county over 30,000, a city in a county with over 600,000. So that's any city, no matter its size, if the county has over 600,000 people. And then only certain types of special districts. There's those special districts that have a website and meet one of the following requirements. The special district covers all of a county with a population of over 600,000, and it has 200 or more full-time equivalent employees. If the special district has a website and has 1,000 or more full-time equivalent employees, or if it has the special district has a website and it has $400 million or more in annual revenue, plus 200 or more full-time equivalent employees. And as noted on the right, other bodies at these agencies, so that's committees, planning commissions, other types of commissions that might be advisory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they are not subject to these requirements. So this only applies to the main city council, the board of supervisors, or the board of directors of one of the agencies there on the left. If your agency does not have one of those, or the body that you're concerned about is one of these other types of bodies at the agency, these rules will not apply to those bodies. Next slide, please. So probably the biggest change that applies to eligible legislative bodies is previously, under the Brown Act, agencies were required to provide a physical place where people would go and participate in a meeting. Agencies have the discretion whether to broadcast their meetings and allow members of the public to participate remotely. Sometimes if they had people teleconferencing, members of the legislative body teleconferencing, it would trigger requirements that would require you to allow the public to do that as well. Now that is becoming mandatory for these agencies that have these specific legislative bodies that I just covered on the last slide. So now it is required that these legislative bodies, eligible legislative bodies, provide access and an opportunity for public comment via one of the following: either a two-way telephonic service, that could be dial-in, no internet's required, or a two-way audiovisual platform. And that's an online platform with video conference and telephonic service. And if your agency uses this method of providing public access, the automatic captioning function must be enabled. So I do really want to note one clarification here is that if you use a two-way audiovisual platform like Zoom, you do always have to have a telephonic component. And think of it this way: if you may have a constituent who wants to participate remotely in the meeting, but they don't have internet at home, they should be able to participate by dialing a number and being able to participate in the meeting that way. So if you have an audiovisual platform like Zoom, you do have to have the capability of having someone call into the meeting as well. It has to use both. But you could also just provide it by providing a two-way telephonic service, so without the video component. There are certain exceptions to when this requirement applies. That is, if adequate telephonic or internet service is not operational at the meeting location. And I think a definition of this is if you truly just, if the meeting is taking place in a room that does not have internet access. That might be a hard standard to meet in this day and age of Wi-Fi, et cetera, or if the room is not wired for telephonics service at all. Again, that may be a difficult standard to meet, but there is this exception that's in the law. Other exceptions are if the meeting is taking place outside of the usual meeting location under certain circumstances that are defined in SB 707 under the Brown Act. So, for example, if your body is going out to do an inspection of real property or doing some sort of site tour or facility inspection and having a special meeting where they go and conduct those are exceptions, and you don't have to provide public broadcast or participation to participate remotely in those types of meetings. And then emergency meetings. Let's say there is a true emergency that is going on. There's a fire within the agency that the council is meeting on an emergency basis. These requirements will not apply. Next slide, please. The next requirement is that, and this relates to the prior one, is that the agency, this eligible legislative body, just that one body, has to adopt a policy on disruption of service. And that policy has to include that the body will make a good faith attempt to restore service for at least 1 hour before resuming the meeting. If the body cannot remedy the disruption within 1 hour, it can continue meeting in open session, but it must make a finding by roll call vote that good faith efforts were taken to restore the service, and the public interest in continuing the meeting outweighs the public interest in remote public access. So what this does is it says, because the public generally now has a right to attend the meeting remotely at home and participate in the meeting, if the internet service goes down or there's some other disruption in that feed that is not allowing the public to participate that way, you have to pause the meeting for at least an hour and try and get it fixed before you can resume the meeting. One little caveat that the legislature did include here in these provisions is that if you have a closed session or closed session items on the agenda for that same meeting, your board or council can go in and meet on those closed session items while staff or others are trying to restore the service that would allow you to resume open session when the closed session is done. So you can try and use the time efficiently if you have a closed session matter on the agenda and you've had to pause the meeting. But otherwise, you will have to make, the body will have to make findings to continue if it's not able to restore things. And then finally, just a little note here that this policy on disruption of service cannot be approved on consent. Next slide, please. The next handful of items relate to improving public access and participation in public meetings. And this sort of dovetails with what Alex was talking about, that one of the goals of SB 707 is using technology to improve public access and engagement at meetings. And it includes outreach to communities that may not be as actively engaged in your meetings as they could be. So one requirement is to provide reasonable assistance for translations or interpretation requests. This doesn't mean that your agency has to provide those services, but it has to be ready to respond to a request and ensure that the agency is not doing anything to prevent them from moving forward. So examples might be ensuring that there's sufficient space for an interpreter to stand next to someone at the public comment podium to help them translate. It could include extra time. For example, there are provisions that specifically state, and this pre-existed in the Brown Act, even SB 707, that if someone is having to have something translated in order to provide their public comments, you have to provide them twice the public comment time. But it's not requiring your agency to provide the actual translation or interpretation service. The next requirement down is that some agencies for these eligible legislative bodies only, so again, the main city council, the board of supervisors, or the board of directors of these very large complex special districts, they may be required to translate and post agendas. And there's a threshold for when that becomes required. It has to be translated into any language spoken by 20% or more of the jurisdiction if that population speaks English less than very well. So how do you find out that data to see if you have one of these populations that's subject to this requirement? You use the most recent American Community Survey published by the US Census Bureau. There's a specific question and data sheet in the American Community Survey that provides information on populations that speak English, that do not speak English, and that speak English less than very well. The translation can be made through a digital service, something like Microsoft Translator or Google Translate. Does not necessarily require you to go out and hire a translator to translate each and every agenda, but it does require at least the use of a translation service to provide that translated agenda. And I do want to clarify that this requirement only applies to the agenda itself. It's the main thing that you post out in for the public to see what's on the agenda or the main portion of the agenda. It does not apply to the entire agenda packet. Next slide, please. Another requirement is a series of requirements that largely fall under this concept of engaging with underrepresented communities or allowing communities to understand how your meetings work. So I'm going to go through the requirements one by one. Number one is having an electronic system for accepting and fulfilling requests for agendas and meeting documents through email or an integrated agenda management platform, and providing information on how to make that request with a link on your agency's homepage. I will say regarding this requirement and the very next one, I think most agencies, especially many cities or larger complex agencies, already have something like this. The idea is if there's a place on your website where someone can go in and put in their email address and get emails of the agenda and sign up for the agenda, that would satisfy this. But that your website should include information on how to make this request or get signed up for this type of service so that people could receive agendas. The next requirement down is to have a website on the meeting process. And that must include a general explanation of what the public meeting process is, the process for a member to provide in-person, remote, or written public comment, a calendar of meeting dates, including the time and location of each meeting, and the current posted agenda. Again, as mentioned, I think most agencies that have very solid and robust websites relating to their main legislative body and their agendas already have websites that meet most of these requirements. So really, this is just an effort to go in and make sure that your website meets all of these four requirements that are stated there on the slide and in the law. The next requirement down is to provide a physical space near posted agendas where the public can post agenda translations. And I want to be very clear, this applies regardless of whether or not your agency meets that 20% threshold. Every agency that has an eligible legislative body has to have a physical space near posted agendas where the public, a member of the public, could come up and post a translation of the agenda. The concept here is that let's say you have a small language minority within your community and they want to be more active in meetings and allow their community to be more active in meetings, and a member of that community wants to translate agendas so that members can come and know what's going on and look at the agenda where it's publicly posted at City Hall. The idea is there's a place for them to publicly post that translated agenda, even if your agency is not responsible for doing that translation. Do have some thoughts on this. I would highly encourage agencies to be very specific that this is an area for accurate copies of the agenda only. It is not just an open forum or an open area where members of the public can post anything related to the agency or to the agenda that they want, and that it's only for agenda translations. And that can help avoid getting into maybe some First Amendment issues if you've created a forum for people to post whatever they want. So being very specific about what can be there and that other things will be taken down might be important. And then finally, the last requirement related to this is that agencies with eligible legislative bodies must make efforts to invite groups that do not normally participate in their meetings. You can use media organizations serving such communities, outreach to civic and community groups, etc. The law is very broad on this and provides a lot of discretion to agencies on how they do this outreach and what underrepresented may or may not mean in their particular community. That's not defined in the law, but it does reference underrepresented communities and communities that do not speak English. And the law does also provide some protection against causes of action for doing this, but there is a fundamental requirement for agencies to undertake these outreach efforts. And before we move on from this slide, I do want to take a moment to note that there is a law pending in the legislature. It's SB 1187 that would eliminate many of these new translation and language assistance mandates, but it would leave in the electronic agenda request system. So lawmakers are recognizing that implementation of some of these requirements is cumbersome or may not provide the public benefit that was foreseen when they were adopted. And I do want to note, though, agencies should continue complying with SB 707 unless and until SB 1187 is adopted and approved. It is proposed as an urgency ordinance, so if it is passed by the legislature and signed by the governor, it would go into effect immediately. It wouldn't be delayed until January 1st. But until that law is ultimately passed and signed into law, I'm sorry, that bill is ultimately passed and signed into law, agencies should continue complying with all the requirements of SB 707. Next slide, please. And that brings us to questions. So I'll turn things back to Melissa if you want to kick us off with questions.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. So as a reminder to our audience, we did receive a lot of questions ahead of time and have been tracking the ones coming in during the presentations. And so we will get to as many of these as possible, but I just want to recognize that we have a lot to potentially get through, and encourage you to add in any additional questions that come up. We continue to keep an eye on all of that. And again, we'll get to as many as possible. And then we'll offer opportunities to follow up and we'll send out resources following today's conversation as well. Okay, so to kick us off, a few questions have come in around clarification. So Alex, I think this is mainly for your part of the presentation. So let me dig into a few of these. Okay. Is there, well, actually, this question, Nick, maybe you can just clarify quickly. Is there a size associated with special districts required to follow the new regulations? So I know you went over that, but maybe just reiterate some of those different size requirements as it relates to agencies on both pieces of this.
Yeah, it's not as simple as just size itself. There are three different potential prongs that can trigger it for special districts. So you have to look at, for one of them, potentially revenue and employees, just straight number of employees if you have over 1,000 or more. And then another, it depends on the population of the county that you're in, if your agency represents the entire county, and then the number of employees. So it's pretty detailed, but I can say most special districts do not fall under the requirements. The vast majority of them do not.
But just to make sure, for clarity, Alex, the pieces that you went through in terms of the changes to the teleconferencing laws would apply. It's just the additional requirements that Nick went over that there's that threshold requirement. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah. It's when you talk about SB 707, it's really important to just bifurcate the conversation into the teleconferencing exceptions that apply to your electeds and appointeds, and then the teleconferencing rules the access we're going to provide to members of the public, right? So one focuses on options for teleconferencing for electeds and appointeds, and that applies to everybody.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying. And as I noted, we will be sending out the slide deck, so you will have the slide that Nick went over with all of those threshold requirements that you can refer back to if you have questions on that specifically. Also saw a few questions come in related to JPAs. So can either of you speak to how either portion of this would apply to joint powers authorities?
I'll I'll start with teleconferencing, and it does. The teleconferencing rules, like I said, apply to all the legislative bodies, and so that would apply to JPAs as well. If you're a JPA, probably the one you should really think about is the new exception for multi-jurisdictional bodies, because oftentimes JPAs are multi-jurisdictional bodies. They're composed of multiple agencies, both intra and inter-county. So you may want to check that out and see if that specific exception applies to you. And if it does, then a lot of your members can meet remotely.
In terms of the eligible legislative body requirements, we looked carefully at this for our joint powers agency clients, and in our view, the eligible legislative body requirements do not apply to JPAs. The legislature was very specific in describing the types of agencies and the types of bodies that are subject to the eligible legislative body requirements, and it was very specific to cities, counties, and special districts, and the boards or councils thereof. There was not a broad definition. So, for example, by contrast, the definition of local agency that is in the main portion of the Brown Act is extremely broad and ends with any other local public agency. And that's the type of language that would capture something like a joint powers agency. You may, of course, want to always check with your agency counsel on applicability. There may be room for disagreement, but in our view, it does not apply to joint powers. Those provisions do not apply to joint powers agencies.
Okay. And one more clarifying question as it relates to agencies subject to this. Are there any distinctions or differences for charter cities that folks should be aware of?
There are not. The Brown Act is a matter of statewide concern. The legislature has said that all agencies are subject to these requirements. So unless your charter city wants to go above and beyond these requirements, that's an option. But this is a baseline that applies to all agencies.
Okay, thank you. Okay, there was a couple of clarifying questions that I want to get to also that came in as it related to Alex, when you were talking through reasonable accommodation. Is there any specific timeline that folks need to request a reasonable accommodation? Any considerations there from a timeline perspective?
Yeah, good question. And the statute is silent on this, right? So it's not really addressed. And when it's not addressed, we can look at other statutes, but practically speaking, I think the remedy here is if someone makes the request, you have to the staff's best ability to seek a reasonable accommodation. The struggle is going to be when this request comes like right before a meeting, right? Like less than 24 hours they give you notice, and if your agency isn't in the habit of providing some kind of teleconferencing means for them to participate, that can be challenging. But I don't think the agency is going to be penalized for not being able to make that accommodation because there's like a feasibility analysis that takes place there. So there is, to answer your question directly, there is no requirement regarding timing. The statute is silent on that point, and best practice is, agencies should use the whatever means it has available to make that accommodation happen. And if it can't, it can't.
I would also really strongly encourage agencies to think about this ahead of time and try and get ahead of it before a request comes in, especially a last minute request. There may be a lot of pressure to grant a last minute request, but then that can create issues if you maybe have another council member who comes along. And let's say that someone is potentially abusing this ability or right, and you might request more information from them and a more intensive process. You can then get into potential discriminatory allegations that your agency is discriminating or distinguishing between one member of the legislative body and another. So getting ahead of this, thinking about what your agency's normal practices are about reasonable accommodations and what that process looks like, and communicating that and upfront to your members might go a long way to making sure that this does not become a problem down the road. Can become
And
really.
one point of clarification there too on what Nick was saying about discrimination. Previously, I had mentioned that that list of teleconferencing options are options and they're voluntary, with the exception of this reasonable accommodation one, right? So whereas the agency doesn't necessarily need to provide the option for just cause and emergency circumstances and all that, it doesn't need to. If a member of the legislative body requests a reasonable accommodation under the ADA, you have to provide that, right? So that's the only one that's a shall instead of a may.
Okay, yes, that's a great clarification to make. And a related question on this topic is if slash how does that need to be acknowledged on the agenda or any posting of the agenda? In terms of
So
the reasonable accommodation, if the agency is allowing for a reasonable accommodation, does that information need to be shared?
yeah, we just have to be clear about what that reasonable accommodation is for, right? Because there's two different types, like I mentioned. If the reasonable accommodation is being requested by the elected official, right? Then in the minutes, you can note that that elected official participated remotely, but you wouldn't list like the disability or anything like that. Um, but in the agenda, on the face of the agenda, there should always be a little section, a little blurb that talks about if you need a reasonable accommodation for members of the public, you can make a request and then we can make an accommodation accordingly. But in terms of the agenda itself, acknowledging the method of participation of the um, elected official, if it's been requested ahead of time, yeah, you should. If the elected official is going to participate via Zoom under this reasonable accommodation exception, then you should put that Zoom link on the agenda.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. Um, Another clarification question, Alex, this was during your presentation on the traditional teleconferencing rules. Um, is it just in person or just from within the jurisdiction of the local agency? Um, so for the quorum requirements, I apologize. So does the quorum piece of that conversation, does it apply just for folks in person in chambers for the council or board, or would that quorum apply if somebody's in the jurisdictional boundaries but remotely
Right. Yeah,
teleconferencing?
that's a good So we did this, as you remember, Melissa, twice. This is the second time we're doing it,
Yes.
and the first time we did it, um, there was some confusion, honestly, on my part regarding this issue. And so under the traditional method, right, we got clarity later. Under the traditional method, quorum needs to be established not from necessarily one physical location, but from within the jurisdictional boundary of the agency. It's an interesting distinction that doesn't exist for all the other remote exceptions.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. Um, Nick, a clarifying question as it relates to eligible legislative bodies. Planning commissions would not be subject to that, correct? Because it applies only to the main governing body of that agency?
That's correct.
Okay. And by extension, I believe you mentioned that would be like all advisory councils or boards or bodies that make recommendations up to that council or board would not be subject to that, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. Any of the requirements that I went through on eligible legislative bodies, it only applies to that main legislative body. It doesn't apply to any subsidiary or other bodies of the agency.
Okay, great. Um, and so I believe this applies to some of the exceptions you all talked about, but can you further clarify when Brown Act bodies can hold meetings entirely virtually?
So to my knowledge, there's only one way, and that's the emergency exception. And now Before it was only during a declared state of emergency, and now you can have it during a declared state of emergency as well as a declared local emergency. And I don't know, Nick, am I missing anything? I think that's the only one.
The only other one I can think of is the subsidiary, I think the eligible
Right.
subsidiary body
Thank you.
teleconferencing option also can be fully remote. So it's another technically form of teleconferencing, but those are the only two ways. So
That just on that subsidiary body point, um, the one thing that just makes that a little bit confusing is a staff person needs to be physically present at a physical location. So not only are you so you're only allowing all your electeds or appointed officials that serve on that legislative body, all of them can be remote, but your staff person needs to be physically present at a physical location that's been agendized, which is different than the state of emergency where just everyone can be remote and we're okay. But Nick's right. The entire body can be remote under that subsidiary body exception too.
But that would allow, if a staff person has to be at an agendized posted site, would allow for public participation at said site, if I'm understanding you
Yeah,
correctly.
correct.
Okay.
So they could participate remotely or they could show up in person where the staff person is at for the subsidiary body exception.
Okay. Perfect. A clarifying question related to the broadcasting disruption piece. So Alex, I know you went through all of the different pieces here, but we have a question as it relates to if I guess just what the rules are for broadcasting disruption if folks or a member of the governing body is participating remotely through the just cause exception.
Mhm. So if a member is participating via just cause, um, and their feed breaks up, right? So let's just say it's me, and let's say this is the legislative body's meeting right now, and I'm an elected official and I'm participating remotely. If my computer starts shutting down for something, like it starts restarting automatically, that's a me problem, and so we don't have to stop the meeting for me. But if Melissa, you're running the meeting, if ILG's link for some reason breaks, or your computer starts restarting, and so all of us are prohibited that are participating remotely from participating, then we would have to stop the meeting. And you know, again, we're talking about teleconferencing here. The rule for eligible legislative bodies is a little bit different. So I don't know if Nick, if you had anything more to expand on that one.
yes, just without trying to cause too much confusion, the legislature did sort of create a couple problems here. One is that for eligible legislative bodies that regularly and are required to broadcast their meetings, if if you have a disruption, there's a requirement that you have to wait an hour, you have to try and restore it.
Mhm.
You can resume the meeting if you make certain findings, etc. If your agency is not one of, or your body is not one of those eligible legislative bodies, the rules that apply for teleconferencing and allow the public to participate under just cause, for example, there is no 1 hour time limit. It just says you have to pause the meeting and you can't take further action. So you have to carefully look and work with your agency counsel to figure out what type of meeting do we have going on? Do we have somebody who's participating, let's say, under just cause? And do we have access to that 1 hour option? But if the service goes down, the public cannot participate, and you're just under those just cause rules because you have a member participating that way, you may have to stop the meeting entirely if you cannot restore the service. So that gets really into the weeds, but work closely with your agency counsel
Yeah.
to figure out that situation because it could require you to stop the meeting indefinitely.
And I would say that's a good rule of thumb across the board. If you have very specific questions to something your agency is doing or has come across, definitely utilize your agency counsel as a resource in that space as well. Um, in terms of the language access piece, we have received a number of questions there. Um, a question as it relates to the actual technology. So, do does the platform that folks choose have to be able to have that translation capacity? So for example, with Zoom, there's obviously the channel that you can go into and allow for that real-time interpretation piece. Is that a requirement as it relates to the language access changes in 707?
No, it's not. Language translation, live language translation as part of the Zoom is not required by SB 707. What is required is that if you are an eligible legislative body and you're broadcasting and you're using the video conference way of broadcasting to the public, you have to have closed captions turned on. That is a requirement, but not live language translation.
Okay. In terms of some of the new public participation pieces, so if an agency is broadcasting via Zoom or another um, two-way video conferencing platform, can agencies require folks who want to make public comment sign up? Or so same as like comment cards when you're in a physical space, can that requirement be translated to the virtual participation, and what does that look like if so?
So normally, and folks may be familiar with this, normally in our old world of the Brown Act, you can't require someone necessarily to give their name or to give detailed information before in order to provide public comment. There is language now in the post SB 707 world and in the world of Zoom meetings where if you have a platform that requires registration for someone to participate in a meeting, then that type of registration is okay. So there is language specifically that allows that if it is part of the platform, your agency cannot go say, fill out this other form in order to participate remotely in the meeting. But if it is part of your platform, then that's okay. That's okay.
And what about directly related to if they want to make public comment? Is there a virtual do you have recommendations for agencies on how they run through that? Is it just folks raising their hands? Do you just allow folks to type in the chat and then those are in the public record? What any best practices or tips that you can share with folks in that space?
I don't think I'll just reacting to the example you threw out. I think
Well,
allowing people to type in the chat. Sorry. I think allowing people to type in the chat and making that part of it is not sorry, all of my phones are ringing. Allowing someone to type in the chat and making that part of the public record is not what I would recommend. I think it's highly platform dependent based on what you're using. I mean, having a raised hand function is going to provide the most orderly way of making sure that you are doing public comment. One just little note on this is I would always say at the beginning of the meeting, most agencies I think do this, but at the beginning of the meeting, tell people who are participating remotely how they can raise their hand. Whether they're in the platform or if they're on the phone, I think it's pressing like star 6 or something. I think it's just a helpful reminder. Even if it's on your agenda, just have something very brief to let them know how to raise their hand. Because I don't think you want to get into a back and forth with someone about, oh, I didn't know how to provide public comment.
yes, no, that's a great tip. Um, okay, so again, probably, yeah, as you mentioned, dependent on the platform and the capabilities of the platform, but some way for folks to indicate that they want to make public comment, whether that's through a raise hand function, et cetera, would be the best way to try to manage the virtual piece of public comment, if I'm
One
hearing you
other note I
correctly.
will make on this is that the language in the Brown Act relating to virtual public comment, um, it says that the agency shall allow a reasonable amount of time per agenda item to allow members of the public to the opportunity to provide public comment, including time for members of the public to register, basically to raise their hand or put in their name and email if that's part of what the platform requires. So one thing just to note is when your secretary or clerk is going through the meeting, um, just to take a beat and allow somebody to raise their hand and not just say there's no public comment and move on. Make sure that there's an opportunity for someone to be able to raise their hand or register that they want to speak.
On that point too, the way we do it at one of my clients is we ask, has the city received any written public comment? And then the city clerk will say no. And then we'll say, is there any oral public comment? And then if there is, then we take all the oral comment. And then we go to the virtual people on Zoom and say, is there anyone on Zoom that would like to make a comment? So that whole process that we go through for each individual agenda item gives everyone enough time to take advantage of the hand raise feature.
Hmm.
Uh, Perfect. Thank you for clarifying that. Um, can either of you speak to consequences for an agency for failure to comply? Does the new law address any or outline any of that information?
Um, so the benefit, so the new law doesn't, and I'll let Nick talk through the how the language around eligible legislative body is pretty forgiving for violations of that section. But generally speaking, the Brown Act is um, has like a very favorable procedure to resolve enforcement issues. So if there's an allegation that's, we violated the Brown Act, someone can't just sue you. There's a procedure in place where they have to submit in writing the alleged violation that took place, and they have to give us an opportunity to fix it. And so that's true of basically everything you've heard today. So if for whatever reason, let's just say that um, one of the elected officials participated in a decision and voted on decision and their vote was counted, and for whatever reason it shouldn't have been counted, it's okay. What you'll probably receive a letter in the mail, and then you're just going to re-agendize a discussion of that item, and you can have another vote basically on that item at a future meeting, and it'll resolve the issue. And that's just one example, but I don't know, Nick, do you have anything to add on that one?
No, there are no additional enforcement mechanisms. It depends on what the type of issue is under the Brown Act, and some of those actions can potentially be declared null and void, but that's only for specific types of violations of the Brown Act, and even then, your agency has an opportunity to cure and correct, or to say, and if it's not one of those particular types of violations, then it still has the ability to respond and say, we don't think there was an issue here. We're not going to change our practices, etc. But in either type of situation, your agency has an opportunity to respond or decide how to treat it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Can you all speak to so when we're talking about teleconferencing rules and folks participating from other venues, and so specifically under the general teleconferencing rules where those locations have to be disclosed. Um, are there any ADA compliance rules as it relates to that? So do the participants or the electeds that are participating remotely need to choose a location that is ADA accessible for those areas as well?
So this is really only relevant, I think, for the traditional method, right? Because for all the other ones we talked about, you don't have to open up that space to a member of the public. But under the
Correct.
traditional method, you have to open up that space to the members of the public. So the question then becomes, if you open up a space that's not ADA accessible, is that a violation of the ADA? Probably.
Okay.
I'm not aware
So
of a
something
case
to
that
be
says that, but
considered.
probably. Yeah.
Okay. So something folks might want to consider if they're choosing remote access locations under the general teleconferencing rules.
Sorry, Melissa, one question I often get actually um, is can I participate remotely from my car? Because it's often the case you get people driving, they're just late to the meeting. So
Hmm.
they're trying to get there and they want to know, can I just call in from my car? I'll be there in like 20 minutes. And 9 times out of 10, the answer is no. And the answer is no, because under the traditional method, right, you have to list on the agenda where you're taking that call from, and you have to note, you have to make that space available to the public, and that's just not possible if you're driving in. Under these new remote exceptions, if you're just calling, it's also still probably no, because a simple phone call doesn't satisfy the requirement, right? It has to be audiovisual. So I suspect that you could have a situation maybe where you're taking advantage of just cause, and you have your phone kind of on your dashboard and you turn on the video so they can see you and you're driving and you're talking. Maybe that's possible, but simply calling in while you're driving, probably not a feasible way to participate remotely under the Brown Act.
Okay. Um, Let me see here. I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. Um, so folks have asked if the members of the public, so you've provided clarity on the visual video capability needed for the members of the governing body, but do the members of the public also need to be able to participate and be on video as well, or is a phone only option acceptable?
In general, our view is that phone only is acceptable for members of the public. The idea it being that they can see what is going on in the room, but and the other thing I would note is that one of the options under for eligible legislative bodies is for there to be a telephonic only option. So that might be another reason for considering the telephonic only option if you're worried about maybe this being construed as requiring video, but generally that's not my understanding of most agencies' practice or what I would necessarily see as required by SB 707. But there may be room for disagreement. There might be pieces of the law that could be pointed to in the other direction. So I don't know if Alex, if this has come up for you, if you have different thoughts on it.
No, I totally agree. I just wanted to highlight again, it's confusing and it's a very fine detail, but the remote participation requirements for the elected and appointed officials is different than
Mhm.
the remote participation requirements for members of the public. And again, it's worth checking the statute to get that distinction right.
Right. Okay. Okay. Well, we're coming up on time, and I do want to share a couple of resources that we have for you all. So I apologize if we didn't get to your question. We will again share information back out with you all. And I do want to note one question I see in here is of a question about if we have any agency websites that are doing a really good job of that outreach and engagement with underrepresented communities. So that's something that we can look into and perhaps share some examples as a follow-up as well. But I do want to make sure that we can highlight a couple of things that we have available to you all. One, Nick and Alex, you heard mention that we did this earlier this year when the first half of the rules went into effect, and at that time they helped us develop a sample policy as it relates to disruption of telephonic or internet services during meetings of eligible legislative bodies. And so that sample policy is available on our website, and I'll make sure to include a direct link to it in the follow-up email that we send to all of you. And then we also recently updated the document you see on the right there called the ABCs of Open Government Laws. So that gives you kind of a little bit of a cheat sheet as it relates to some of these laws like the Brown Act and what they require of agencies. And so we will provide links of both of these to you all. So I wanted to flag that. Um, we also have virtual and in-person trainings and workshops that we can work with your agency on if you need to do more in-depth conversations on any of these things as it relates to public engagement and outreach, as it relates to governance needs. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you'd like more information there. Just a quick plug for our impact report that we recently released, which gives you a snapshot of our recent trainings and resources and things of that nature that may be helpful to you all as you're doing your work in your agencies across the state. And then a quick plug for our our outreach channels. So if you aren't already connected with us, please sign up for our newsletter, connect with us on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook. That's a great way for you to stay in touch with us and hear about new resources that we have coming online or additional training, workshops in some of these spaces. And lastly, as I mentioned at the beginning, and as you've heard, we are recording today's session. We will send out a link to that recording as well as the resources we mentioned here, the slide deck, and things like that to all of you in the next few days. So keep an eye out for that. And then I'll put up our contact information quickly. But I wanted to give Alex, Nick, any final closing thoughts for our audience before we let them go.
Just one comment. If SB 1187 does pass, Nick and I will update that model policy to reflect those changes. Currently, that policy, I think he submitted it back in March, and so it's current right now as the law stands. But if SB 1187 goes into effect, we'll make sure to update that and send that to you, Melissa, so you could circulate that more broadly.
Fantastic. Definitely will do that. Nick, any closing thoughts for our folks before we let them go?
No, just thank you everyone for participating. I know this is a really difficult and cumbersome topic, so thank you for being here and asking great questions.
Perfect. And I also want to extend my thank you to Alex and Nick for spending the afternoon with us, sharing your expertise and your experience with this as everybody's trying to navigate the new regulations here. And we will keep an eye on this. And as Alex mentioned, definitely we'll update that sample policy if that comes to be a need at the end of this legislative cycle. And thank you to all of you on the line for joining us this afternoon. Please stay in touch and don't hesitate to reach out with additional questions. Thank you all.